Hey guys, welcome to Through the Bible Verse by Verse, a plain and simple study through the entire Bible, book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse. We are currently in the book of Genesis. Yes, we're starting from the beginning. We're going to go all the way through the book of Revelations. Of course, that's a long journey. All right, but we're in chapter 2, and we're talking about the creation of man. At this point, God has created. We've already studied the 6 days of creation, and the whole purpose was that God can set man into his creation, and man would rule as God ordained or decreed for him to rule. Verse 7, and I'm going to take a couple of sessions because I'm going to deal with the being of man. What is man? And the reason why I'm taking this time is because you're going to be surprised that if you understand this, in other words, why do we act the way we act? And there's some other things that I want to talk about that I think that will help us to understand at the very least. In Genesis chapter 2 and then verse 7, this is where we left off. Verse 7, it says, Then the Lord God formed the man out of the dust from the ground and breathed the breath of life into his nostrils. The man became a living being, or you can say a complete human being. I want to talk about, again, what is this being? What is man? And when it says here that God created man, he breathed into him, the word breath there could actually be spirit, breathe spirit. So oftentimes people think in terms of breath of life as in air. In the last study, I kind of talked about this progressive Christian that tried to use this to prove that the baby is only a fetus until it has the breath or air. He tried to use that, but anyway, what he's talking about here is God breathed into him life. In the book of James, in the book of James, we're told that like it's the body without the spirit is dead, and then he said, so faith without works is dead. But he lays out this truth that like it's the body without the spirit is dead. So I want to kind of talk about then the idea of what is man. And I'm going to talk about then spirit, soul, and body. Or I'm going to talk about, again, I'll talk about the spirit. Spirit, soul, and body. It doesn't matter which order I kind of go into. What we see here in Genesis is that God created, he formed man from the dust. We know that the body have the same elements, okay, of the earth, okay. Man, when decomposes, right? I think if you go into a tomb or a casket that has been sitting up, I don't know however many years. I think if you open up the Bible, open up the casket, excuse me, you're going to find a pile of dust, right? Anyway, I did make this point in one of the previous sessions, though, that if man, if in the evolution scale we started in water, then how do we get to the physical elements of the earth? And I have to be careful about even these kind of questions, since I am, again, not a scientist, but I'm only wondering and asking the question. The larger question I want to deal with is, what is man? What did God create? Now think about this. What did God create? So when he says here, a living being, if you're reading other translations like the King James, a living soul. So what God created was, and then when we say a human being, man is a spirit. He lives, he has a soul, and he lives in a body, or that's in the body. In the case of man, all three components are important. They are together. They are, and actually, eventually will be eternally linked. The spirit and the soul, I'm going to talk about them probably in each session. The spirit and the soul are the immaterial part of man, and then the body is the physical part of man. Okay? God designed and created for man to operate as a three-part being, spirit, soul, and body. Now, you cannot separate the soul and the spirit. Death separates the soul and the spirit from the body, but from God's eternal plan, whether you're in hell or heaven, we're going to have that spirit, soul, and body. We're going to, the term resurrection that's what is going on. The term resurrection means body stand. What is going to happen in eternity, in the judgment of the resurrection of the just and the unjust, excuse me, you're going to have your body. One way or the other, when I say one way or the other, whether you're the just or unjust, you're still going to have a body, and you're going to have that body for eternity. All right, but right now, what God created, as we're looking at it from Adam's perspective, and of course, before sin, then we see the spirit, soul, and body. The picture we have here is God forming his body, so what you see, our bodies. And then God, when he said breathe, it actually you can say the spirit is what he's talking about. God breathed in him the spirit. So that breath of life wasn't air, but the spirit. And that's when man became a living body, a living soul. Okay, what is the spirit? And I think it's important to understand. And we understand it. What is the spirit? Now I said all three are designed by God to live in harmony. But what is the spirit? So the spirit is the real you. When I say real you, remember at death, our spirit and soul is separated from our bodies. Your spirit, in other words, if I was to, you think about the loved ones who have passed on, they've died. From our perspective here in the earth, we're looking at their bodies, right? Usually in the casket, okay. The more unfortunate is in a less pleasant, a less pleasant kind of thing. Sometimes a loved one, if you witness them die. Anyway, you see a body of a person who's dead. Okay, so we see their bodies, and in some respect, we kind of see it just like as God here before God would have. The order is reversed. Now, from Genesis, we're seeing that God's forming the body, and it's kind of interesting because I'm picturing in my mind that if we could see that, you see Adam, his body, right, sitting up there, and maybe his eyes open, right, and for all intents and purposes, that would have been a dead body. At the time that God is creating Adam, before he breathed the spirit into him, that was a dead body, right? God forms him, but then God breathes life. Now we see it from the reverse angle. People have the breath of life, the spirit of life, and when they die, that spirit comes out, okay? And some people kind of liken it in terms of exhaling. I guess when you breathe your last, okay. So, but what is that spirit? That spirit is the real you. That if you go to heaven right now, if you was to die and you go to heaven right now, your spirit is separated from your body. But that spirit is that is a spirit being, and right now that spirit being is in heaven. And that spirit being would look like you, we would assume, but it certainly would have your thoughts, it would have your emotions, have your personality. And one of the things that we can see about that is, think about the Mount Transfiguration. Now, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John. They go up in the mountain, and he is changed. He becomes so bright, right, that it blinds them. And after that blinds them, you see this kind of transformation. You see the glory of God from within shine out. Peter wakes up in them, and they're dazed by this, dazzled and dazed. But what they all of a sudden now they see Elijah and Moses. Now here's the interesting thing. They see Elijah and Moses, who happened to stop by, and they was talking with Jesus. Well, wait a minute. We know that in the case of Elijah, he had been dead for 8 centuries. Okay, now his body, we don't know where it's at. He went up to heaven, he was gone. In the case of Moses been dead for 15 centuries. Now we know the Bible gives testimony that he was buried, and there was a little tussle between Michael the archangel and Satan. Michael the archangel was dispatched to bury the body of Moses. So what is it that we're looking at? Their spirits. What is that we see? You see them, and I think by revelation, Peter, James, and John was able to distinguish that's Moses and Elijah. Okay, we have another glimpse when King Saul was under judgment with God, and he goes to a witch. We would call him today a medium, a spiritist, and he says, and she ends up calling the prophet Samuel up. She calls Samuel up, and all of a sudden she freaks out. She goes, "Oh my God, you know!" And when she freaks out, he said, "What do you see?" He said, "I see an old man," and it was the prophet Samuel. And I'm not going to get into the debate over whether or not if that was a familiar spirit. A lot of people have said that because I don't know. I just think they're not thinking that God is sovereign for his purpose. He can do whatever he wants. But anyway, it was Samuel. Here's my point. Samuel had already died, had been dead for a little time at least anyway. What did he see? He saw his spirit. The other picture we see, Jesus gives us a picture in Luke chapter 16, where the rich man and the poor man dies. The rich man and the poor man, we see them alive. The poor man used to beg at the rich man's table. The rich man did not have any regard for him. Jesus said they both died. He said the rich man died and was buried. But then the story continues on. In hell, he lifts up his eyes, being in torment. He sees Lazarus, the poor man, over there. My point is, stop. What are we looking at? Their spirits, because their bodies are already in the ground. We're seeing them in the netherworld, as it's called, or Abraham's bosom, and yet their spirit. And here's the interesting thing that we see about their spirit. Their spirit is always conscious. In other words, death doesn't mean that you lose consciousness. Now, there are those who believe in what's called soul sleep. And again, there are too many other verses that show you that there is no soul sleep. For example, Elijah and Moses stopping by and they're talking with Jesus. Anyway, so the idea is that my spirit is what's the life of my being, the spirit. Okay, it is the real me in that I can exist without my body. So right now, we can surmise that there is activity going on in heaven. That they're your loved ones, right? Your friends and loved ones who have died in the Lord, that they are now in heaven with a great fellowship. Paul kind of says that they have this sense of nakedness and that they're desiring to be clothed with their new bodies. However, but as we've seen from scripture examples, Elijah and Moses, the rich man and Lazarus, and Samuel, these are glimpses of people who have died. They did not lose conscience, okay? They did not lose any consciousness. They were, alert. And the main thing is that, so that's why death is not to be feared for the believer, even though we do fear it. It's just instinctive in us that death is something to be feared. We don't have to fear it because our faith should know that to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord.